The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering columns of the Supreme Court building, its rays catching the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to history. Inside the hallowed chamber, tension crackled with the intensity of a gathering storm. Every seat was occupied, every breath held in anticipation of what many legal scholars were already calling the most significant voting rights case in a generation. Kamala Harris adjusted her navy blazer one final time before pushing through the heavy wooden doors. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor seemed to echo with purpose, each step a declaration of intent. Behind her, a small army of brilliant legal minds followed, associates from her firm carrying briefcases stuffed with precedents, constitutional scholars with their dog-eared copies of landmark decisions, and paralegals whose fingers trembled slightly as they clutched their carefully organized files. "Breathe," she whispered to herself, a habit she had developed during her prosecutorial days. The familiar ritual steadied her nerves as she took in the scene before her. The gallery buzzed with barely contained energy. Journalists from every major network sat with pens poised, their cameras trained on the bench where 9 justices would soon determine the fate of electoral access for millions of Americans. Law students from Georgetown and George Washington University pressed against the barriers, their young faces bright with the idealism that still believed the Constitution could be a living document of justice rather than a static relic of bygone intentions. At the petitioner's table, Harris spread her materials with practiced precision. Each document had been reviewed dozens of times, every argument honed to surgical sharpness. The case before them, Martinez v. State Election Board, seemed straightforward on its surface, whether new identification requirements disproportionately affected certain communities' ability to participate in democracy. But Harris knew that beneath the technical language lay something far more fundamental, the ongoing struggle between expanding access and maintaining what some called electoral integrity. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed across the chamber, and the familiar ritual began. The black-robed figures emerged from behind the burgundy curtain like actors taking their positions for the final act of a long-running drama. Chief Justice Roberts, with his silver hair and measured demeanor, took his central seat. To his right, the conservative stalwarts arranged themselves with the confidence of those who had held the majority for years. To his left, the liberal justices settled in with the determined expressions of those accustomed to crafting dissents that they hoped would become tomorrow's majority opinions. But it was Justice Clarence Thomas who drew Harris' attention. At 77, he remained an imposing figure despite his advancing years. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the courtroom before settling on her with unmistakable assessment. There was something in that gaze, not merely disagreement, but something deeper and more personal that made Harris' spine straighten involuntarily. "Well, hear argument first this morning in Case 24-891, Martinez v. State Election Board," Chief Justice Roberts announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Ms. Harris, you may proceed." Harris rose with fluid grace, her movement drawing the attention of every person in the chamber. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whir of ventilation systems and the distant hum of Washington traffic beyond the thick walls. "Chief Justice Roberts, and may it please the court," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "This case strikes at the heart of what the founders envisioned when they spoke of a more perfect union. The question before you today is not merely about identification requirements, but about whether the promise of democratic participation extends equally to all citizens or remains the privilege of a select few." She paused, allowing the words to settle in the chamber like sediment in still water. In the gallery, she could see heads nodding, law professors recognizing a masterclass in constitutional advocacy, students scribbling notes frantically, journalists already crafting their opening paragraphs. "The 15th Amendment," Harris continued, "was not merely a suggestion or an aspiration. It was a mandate, forged in the crucible of our nation's darkest period and ratified with the blood of those who believed that democracy meant something more than a word on parchment." Justice Thomas shifted in his chair, a movement so subtle that only those trained in reading courtroom dynamics would notice. But Harris caught it, the way a predator senses the first sign of movement in the underbrush. "Ms. Harris," Thomas interjected, his voice cutting through her presentation like a blade through silk. "Are you suggesting that states have no authority to ensure the integrity of their electoral processes? That any requirement, no matter how reasonable, constitutes an unconstitutional burden?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at dawn. Harris felt the shift in the room's energy, the way conversations changed when someone introduced an unexpected element of danger. "Justice Thomas," she replied, her tone respectful but firm, "I'm suggesting that the Constitution requires us to examine not just the stated purpose of such requirements, but their practical effect on the fundamental right to vote. When identification requirements disproportionately affect communities that have historically faced barriers to political participation, we must ask whether we're truly protecting democracy or merely changing the methods by which some citizens are excluded from it." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. There was something almost predatory in his expression, as if he had been waiting for this moment, this opportunity to engage in intellectual combat with an opponent worthy of his attention. "And who, Miss Harris, appointed you the arbiter of what constitutes appropriate protection of electoral processes? Your arguments seem to rest on emotion rather than constitutional text." The words carried a subtle sting, a questioning not just of her legal reasoning but of her right to make such arguments at all. In the gallery, reporters straightened in their seats, sensing that something beyond ordinary legal discourse was unfolding. Harris felt the familiar fire kindling in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced in courtrooms from Oakland to Washington, when opponents underestimated her intellectual firepower. But she kept her voice level, professional. "Justice Thomas, with respect, my arguments rest on 60 years of this court's jurisprudence, beginning with your own landmark decision in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections, which held that wealth cannot be a barrier to political participation. If economic barriers are unconstitutional, surely we must examine whether other barriers, however cleverly disguised as protective measures, serve the same exclusionary function." The reference to precedent was surgical in its precision, and Thomas' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the bench, other justices exchanged glances. Justice Jackson leaned forward with interest, while Justice Gorsuch made a note on his legal pad. "Ms. Harris," Thomas said, his voice carrying a new edge, "perhaps your time as a politician has clouded your understanding of constitutional interpretation. This court deals in law, not in the sort of partisan advocacy that characterizes legislative chambers." The insult was delivered with such casual precision that it took a moment for its full impact to register. The chamber seemed to draw a collective breath. Chief Justice Roberts looked up sharply from his notes, while Justice Breyer's eyebrows rose in surprise. Even the court reporters paused in their transcription, as if uncertain whether they had heard correctly. Harris felt the blow land, felt the eyes of every person in the chamber turn toward her. The silence stretched like a taut wire, pregnant with possibility and danger. She could feel her heart beating against her ribs, could sense the weight of history pressing down on the moment. In the gallery, she could see the faces of young lawyers who had come to watch a master at work, law students who had skipped classes to witness constitutional history in the making, journalists whose fingers hovered over their phones, ready to transmit news of whatever was about to unfold. Justice Thomas sat back in his chair with what might have been satisfaction, as if he had just delivered a decisive blow in a contest that had been building for years. His eyes remained fixed on Harris, waiting for her response, perhaps expecting her to retreat or deflect. But Harris had not reached this moment, had not survived the crucible of prosecution, politics, and now advocacy, by backing down from fights that mattered. She placed her hands on the lectern, her knuckles white against the dark wood, and felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every challenge of her career. The silence stretched on, electric with anticipation, as if the very foundations of the Supreme Court were holding their breath to see what would happen next. In that moment, suspended between insult and response, between tradition and transformation, Kamala Harris prepared to cross a line from which there would be no return. The marble halls had witnessed many historic moments, but none quite like this one. As the seconds ticked by in profound silence, everyone present seemed to understand that they were about to witness something that would be remembered, discussed, and analyzed for years to come. Justice Thomas waited, his expression unreadable but expectant. Harris lifted her chin, her eyes blazing with quiet fire, and prepared to speak words that would echo through the corridors of constitutional law forever. The silence stretched across the marble chamber like a bridge spanning an abyss, each second weighted with the gravity of unspoken consequences. Harris could feel the collective breath of the courtroom held in anticipation, could sense the rapid heartbeats of law students in the gallery, the poised fingers of journalists over their devices, the careful attention of her own legal team seated behind her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the crystalline clarity of mountain air, each word precisely calibrated for maximum impact. "Justice Thomas," she began, her tone carrying the respectful formality required by protocol while somehow managing to convey steel beneath silk, "my understanding of constitutional interpretation was forged in the same fires that shaped this court's greatest decisions. It was honed not in legislative chambers, but in courtrooms where the Constitution's promises were tested against the harsh realities of human experience." She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the bench, taking in the faces of all 9 justices before returning to Thomas with unwavering directness. "My place in this chamber is not determined by political affiliation or personal history, but by the same document that grants every American citizen the right to seek redress through these hallowed halls. That document," she gestured toward the Constitution displayed behind the bench, "recognizes no hierarchy of citizenship, no aristocracy of interpretation." Justice Jackson leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes bright with interest. In the gallery, Harris could see heads turning as spectators registered the shift in dynamics, the way her response had transformed what might have been a moment of retreat into an advance. Though Mass' expression darkened, the lines around his eyes deepening as he processed the elegant way she had turned his attack back upon itself. But rather than retreat, he pressed forward with the determination of someone who had spent decades crafting constitutional arguments. "Ms. Harris, your rhetoric is impressive, but this court requires more than eloquent appeals to emotion." "The framers," Harris interrupted, her voice rising just enough to carry across the chamber without seeming disrespectful, "also intended for this Constitution to serve as a living charter for an evolving nation. Justice Marshall himself recognized in McCulloch v. Maryland that we must never forget it is a constitution we are expounding, a document meant to endure across centuries and adapt to circumstances the framers could never have envisioned." The reference to Marshall was strategic brilliance, invoking the authority of the court's most revered Chief Justice in support of constitutional evolution. Around the bench, several justices exchanged glances, recognizing the sophisticated legal maneuvering taking place before them. Justice Gorsuch, surprising many observers, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Ms. Harris, Justice Thomas raises an important point about textual interpretation. How do you reconcile your position with the principle that judges should interpret the law as written, not as they might wish it to be?" The question came from an unexpected quarter, but Harris recognized it not as an attack but as an opportunity to demonstrate the intellectual rigor of her position. She turned toward Gorsuch with the respect due to a worthy opponent in intellectual combat. "Justice Gorsuch, that principle is fundamental to our judicial system, and I embrace it wholeheartedly. But interpreting the law as written requires us to understand what the text actually means, not merely what it appears to say on first reading. When the 15th Amendment prohibits denial of voting rights on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, we must examine whether modern practices achieve the same exclusionary results through different means." She moved slightly away from the lectern, her body language conveying confidence and engagement rather than defensiveness. "The text hasn't changed, but our understanding of how constitutional principles apply to evolving circumstances must reflect both fidelity to original meaning and recognition of constitutional purpose. Otherwise, we risk becoming archaeological rather than jurisprudential in our approach." Justice Kavanaugh nodded thoughtfully, while Chief Justice Roberts made careful notes. The dynamic in the chamber had shifted perceptibly, from what had begun as a hostile interrogation to something approaching genuine constitutional discourse. But Thomas was not finished. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of decades spent refining his judicial philosophy. "Ms. Harris, you speak of evolution and adaptation, but the Constitution provides mechanisms for change through amendment. What you're advocating sounds suspiciously like judicial legislation, imposing policy preferences under the guise of constitutional interpretation." The charge was serious, striking at the heart of the eternal tension between judicial restraint and constitutional protection of rights. Harris knew that her response would be dissected in law schools and legal journals for years to come. "Justice Thomas, with profound respect for your position, I would suggest that enforcing constitutional protections is not judicial legislation but judicial obligation. When this court decided Brown v. Board of Education, it wasn't legislating new policy, it was recognizing that the Equal Protection Clause meant what it said, even when applied to circumstances the framers hadn't specifically considered. The mention of Brown was deliberate and powerful, invoking perhaps the court's most celebrated rejection of the separate but equal doctrine that had previously been considered constitutionally acceptable. The genius of our constitutional system, she continued, lies not in its rigidity but in its capacity to fulfill its promises across generations. The text remains constant, but our understanding of how to fulfill those textual promises must deepen with experience and wisdom. Justice Jackson, unable to contain her intellectual engagement, joined the conversation. Ms. Harris, how do we distinguish between legitimate constitutional evolution and illegitimate judicial overreach? Harris smiled slightly, recognizing the question as one that lay at the heart of modern constitutional theory. Justice Jackson, I believe the distinction lies in whether our interpretation serves to expand or contract the Constitution's fundamental promise of equal justice under law. When we interpret constitutional provisions in ways that extend protection to previously excluded groups, we're fulfilling the document's aspirational language. When we interpret them to justify new forms of exclusion, we're betraying that promise. The answer was both philosophically sophisticated and practically grounded, the kind of response that demonstrated deep thinking about constitutional purpose rather than mere advocacy for a particular outcome. Justice Alito, who had remained silent through much of the exchange, finally spoke up. Ms. Harris, that sounds like you're advocating for results-oriented jurisprudence, deciding what outcome you want and then finding constitutional justification for it. The question was sharp, probing, designed to expose what conservatives often saw as the fundamental flaw in liberal constitutional interpretation. Harris paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts before responding with characteristic precision. Justice Alito, I'm advocating for purpose-oriented jurisprudence, understanding what the Constitution was designed to accomplish and ensuring that our interpretations serve those purposes rather than undermining them. The results I seek are not policy outcomes but constitutional fidelity. As the exchange continued, something remarkable was happening in the chamber. What had begun as a hostile confrontation between Harris and Thomas had evolved into a genuine intellectual discourse involving multiple justices. The gallery watched with fascination as constitutional philosophy played out in real time, each question and answer adding layers to the legal and philosophical complexity of the case. Justice Thomas, however, seemed increasingly isolated as the discussion progressed. His questions became sharper, more personal, tinged with something that went beyond mere jurisprudential disagreement. Ms. Harris, he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several justices look up from their notes, your entire argument seems to rest on the premise that this court should serve as a super-legislature, correcting what you perceive as democratic failures. Is that really the role the framers envisioned for the federal judiciary? The question was loaded with implication, suggesting not just disagreement with her legal position but questioning her fitness to appear before the court at all. The chamber tensed again, sensing that the personal undercurrents that had begun the session were resurging beneath the veneer of constitutional discourse. Harris felt the shift, recognized the return of hostility that had nothing to do with legal interpretation and everything to do with something deeper and more troubling. Around the bench, other justices exchanged concerned glances, while Chief Justice Roberts shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, pregnant with possibility and danger. Harris could feel the weight of history pressing down on the chamber, the sense that whatever happened next would be remembered and analyzed for decades to come. She took a deep breath, her hands steady on the lectern, and prepared to navigate the treacherous waters between constitutional law and personal dignity, between professional respect and fundamental principle. The marble halls had witnessed many confrontations, but this one felt different, more personal, more consequential, more laden with implications that extended far beyond the specific case before the court. Justice Thomas waited, his expression unreadable but expectant, while the chamber held its collective breath for what would come next. The tension in the chamber had reached a crescendo that seemed to press against the very walls of the Supreme Court building. Chief Justice Roberts, sensing the dangerous undercurrents threatening to overwhelm the proceedings, cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect from the most powerful legal minds in the nation. Perhaps, he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of judicial diplomacy, we should return to the specific constitutional questions raised by this case. Justice Thomas, Ms. Harris, while robust intellectual discourse is the hallmark of this court, we must ensure that our discussion remains focused on legal principles rather than, but Harris, recognizing that some moments in history cannot be managed or contained by institutional protocol, raised her hand slightly, a gesture so subtle yet commanding that it drew every eye in the chamber. Chief Justice Roberts, with the deepest respect for this court's traditions and your authority, I believe Justice Thomas has raised questions that go to the very heart of not just this case, but the foundational principles upon which our entire system of justice rests. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in the marble hall of constitutional law. Harris turned to face Thomas directly, her posture conveying both respect for his position and absolute refusal to be diminished by his hostility. Justice Thomas, you ask whether I see this court as a superlegislature. I see this court as exactly what Chief Justice Marshall envisioned in Marbury v. Madison, the final guardian of constitutional principles when other institutions fail to protect the rights of all citizens. She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the entire bench before continuing. But your question reveals a more troubling concern. It suggests that when a former prosecutor, a former senator, a former vice president of these United States stands before this court to argue constitutional law, her presence here is somehow illegitimate, that her place, to use your earlier terminology, is somewhere other than at this lectern defending the rights guaranteed by our founding document. Justice Jackson's eyes widened slightly at the direct reference to Thomas' earlier comment, while Justice Breyer leaned forward with visible concern. The gallery stirred, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the normally staid proceedings of the nation's highest court. Thomas' face darkened, his jaw setting in a way that suggested years of suppressed frustrations finally finding voice. Ms. Harris, I said nothing about illegitimacy. I questioned whether your arguments reflect constitutional fidelity or political advocacy dressed in legal language. And yet, Harris replied, her voice carrying the prosecutorial precision that had made her reputation, the distinction you draw seems remarkably selective. When Justice Brandeis came to this court from private practice, when Justice O'Connor arrived from state politics, when you yourself joined this bench from the federal circuit, their transitions from other careers were seen as bringing valuable perspective to constitutional interpretation. Why should my path to this lectern be viewed any differently? The question struck like lightning, illuminating contradictions that had been hiding in the shadows of judicial discourse for decades. Around the bench, justices exchanged glances that spoke volumes about conversations held in private chambers, about assumptions never explicitly stated but always present. Justice Gorsuch, surprising everyone in the chamber, leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine intellectual curiosity rather than hostility. Ms. Harris, that's a fascinating point about experiential perspective in constitutional interpretation. Could you elaborate on how your unique background informs your understanding of the voting rights issues before us today? The question was a lifeline thrown across dangerous waters, an opportunity to transform personal conflict into substantive legal discourse. But more than that, it represented something remarkable, a conservative justice publicly acknowledging the value of Harris' perspective in ways that implicitly criticized Thomas' dismissive approach. Harris seized the moment with the skill of someone who had spent her career recognizing when opportunities presented themselves. Justice Gorsuch, my experience as a prosecutor taught me that constitutional rights are meaningless unless they can be effectively exercised by all citizens. I've seen how seemingly neutral requirements can create barriers that effectively deny access to justice. As a senator, I witnessed how electoral processes can be manipulated to favor certain outcomes while maintaining the appearance of fairness. She moved closer to the bench, her voice growing more passionate but never losing its respectful tone. And as vice president, I learned that our democratic institutions are only as strong as the public's faith in their fairness and accessibility. When voting becomes a privilege available only to those who can navigate increasingly complex requirements, we haven't protected democracy, we've simply changed the methods by which some citizens are excluded from full participation. Justice Kavanaugh nodded thoughtfully, while Chief Justice Roberts made careful notes. The dynamic in the chamber had shifted once again, creating space for genuine constitutional discourse despite the personal tensions crackling beneath the surface. But Thomas was not finished. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of someone who felt his fundamental worldview under assault. Ms. Harris, your experiential perspective is noted, but this court must interpret the Constitution as written, not as we might wish it to be in light of contemporary political preferences. The framers provided specific mechanisms for constitutional change, and judicial interpretation cannot substitute for the democratic process. The response was classically originalist, reflecting decades of constitutional philosophy that emphasized textual fidelity over evolutionary interpretation. But Harris was ready for it, having anticipated this exact argument. Justice Thomas, I agree completely that we must interpret the Constitution as written. But the question is what the written text actually means, not what we assume it means based on limited historical perspective. She gestured toward the constitutional display behind the bench. When the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under law, it doesn't specify the methods by which that protection must be ensured. When the 15th Amendment prohibits denial of voting rights based on race, it doesn't limit that protection to the specific practices known to exist in 1870. The text is expansive precisely because the framers understood that constitutional principles must apply to circumstances they could not foresee. Justice O'Connor, the court's newest member, chose this moment to enter the discussion with a question that would prove pivotal. Ms. Harris, Justice Thomas, this philosophical debate is fascinating, but I'm curious about a specific precedent. In Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District v. Holder, this court recognized that voting discrimination can take subtle forms that require careful constitutional scrutiny. How does that precedent inform our analysis of the identification requirements in this case? The question was a masterpiece of judicial craft, referencing a case that strongly supported Harris' position while forcing Thomas to confront binding precedent that undermined his arguments. In the gallery, constitutional law professors sat up straighter, recognizing the significance of the moment. Harris smiled slightly, recognizing the gift she had been given. Justice O'Connor, Northwest Austin establishes precisely the analytical framework needed here. The court recognized that the Constitution requires us to examine not just the stated purpose of electoral regulations, but their practical effect on the fundamental right to vote. When identification requirements disproportionately affect communities that have historically faced barriers to political participation, Northwest Austin compels us to ask whether these requirements serve legitimate state interests or simply provide new methods for achieving old exclusions. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the precedents cited strongly supported Harris' position. But rather than concede the point, he chose to double down on his criticism. Ms. Harris, you continue to argue from outcome rather than text. Perhaps your political background makes it difficult to distinguish between legal interpretation and policy advocacy. The comment was clearly intended as a dismissive blow, but its effect was precisely the opposite of what Thomas intended. A murmur rippled through the gallery, while several justices looked up sharply from their notes. Even in a chamber accustomed to intellectual combat, the personal nature of the attack was unmistakable. Harris paused for a long moment, her hands steady on the lectern, her eyes never leaving Thomas' face. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet power that seemed to fill every corner of the marble chamber. Justice Thomas, my background has taught me many things, but perhaps the most important lesson is that the Constitution belongs to all Americans, not just to those who hold positions of power. It was written not by perfect men with perfect foresight, but by flawed human beings who nonetheless articulated principles transcendent enough to guide a nation through centuries of growth and change. She paused, allowing the words to resonate. The text they wrote promised equal justice under law, not equal justice under law as interpreted by those comfortable with existing arrangements. When we interpret constitutional provisions to exclude rather than include, to limit rather than expand protection of fundamental rights, we betray not just the text but the spirit that animated its creation. The chamber fell silent as Harris delivered what everyone present recognized as a historic moment in constitutional discourse. History will judge us all, she continued, not by how faithfully we preserved the status quo, but by how courageously we fulfilled the Constitution's promise that all citizens, regardless of background, regardless of the path that brought them to seek justice, deserve equal protection under law. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the gravity of constitutional principle and historical consequence. Justice Thomas sat motionless, his expression unreadable, while around him his colleagues absorbed the implications of what they had just witnessed. In the gallery, journalists frantically typed on their devices, law students stared in amazement, and constitutional scholars recognized that they had just witnessed a moment that would be studied and analyzed for generations to come. Chief Justice Roberts, sensing that the extraordinary exchange had reached its natural conclusion, cleared his throat gently. Ms. Harris, thank you for your presentation. The court will take this matter under advisement. As Harris gathered her materials and walked toward the chamber doors, the weight of what had transpired settled over everyone present. The marble halls had witnessed many historic moments, but this confrontation between constitutional philosophy and personal dignity would be remembered as one of the most significant. The session was over, but its implications were just beginning.